The room was silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence, but the kind that weighs on your chest, like a held breath before something irreversible happens. A small boy, barely 10 years old, stood at the center of a room filled with men and women who defined the sound of America. These were Motown's titans, Smokey Robinson, Diana Ross, and at the back of the room, the man whose word could make or end a career, Berry Gordy. Michael's shoes barely touched the floor. His brothers stood behind him, hands clenched, eyes darting nervously. The room smelled of cigarettes, sweat, and anticipation. Berry leaned forward, expression unreadable. His reputation was legendary, sharp, cold, unblinking. He'd seen thousands of hopefuls, each one thinking they had it. Most didn't. He had no time for children who thought they could play star. And now, this, a boy barely tall enough to reach the microphone, trembling under the weight of expectation. Someone whispered, "You ready, kid?" Michael didn't answer. His throat was dry. His heart pounded like a drumbeat inside his chest. Because deep down, he knew. This was it. This wasn't just another performance. This was the door between the life he knew and the life he dreamed of. He had one song, one chance to prove himself, one chance to prove his brothers right, one chance to silence every doubt. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "You mess up and it's over. They'll never call us back." He looked toward Berry Gordy. The man's gaze was steady, indifferent. The kind of look that says, "Show me something I haven't seen before." And then, silence. A heartbeat. Another. Michael took a breath so deep it seemed to pull the air out of the room, and when he opened his mouth, the world changed. The first note didn't just come from a boy, it came from somewhere older, deeper, almost ancient. It was soul and pain and joy and rhythm, all in one trembling voice that filled the room and refused to let go. People looked up. Heads turned. The executives who'd come expecting another child act found themselves frozen. Berry Gordy's hand, which had been tapping impatiently moments before, stopped. His eyes narrowed, then widened. The room no longer belonged to Motown. It belonged to Michael. By the time he hit the last note, silence returned, but this time it was electric. Berry Gordy's face had changed completely. What he said next would shape history. But before that day, before the applause, before the tears, before that life-changing song, there was another story. A story that began far from Motown. A story of hunger, rejection, and a little boy who refused to stop dreaming, because before he earned that one chance, he had to fight for it. Gary, Indiana, 1963. A small industrial town where steel mills choked the air and dreams died young. The Jackson family lived in a tiny house on Jackson Street. 7 kids, 2 rooms, and music that refused to stay inside the walls. Their father, Joseph Jackson, worked long shifts at the mill. Tough, loud, demanding, but he had a vision. He believed his sons could do what he never could, make it out. Inside that cramped living room, the Jackson brothers practiced night after night. Jermaine on bass, Tito on guitar, Jackie on harmony, Marlon struggling to keep rhythm. And in the middle, Michael. At first, he wasn't supposed to sing lead. He was just the little one, watching from the side, copying his brother's moves. But when Joseph caught him singing one night, everything changed. That voice, pure, high, emotional, silenced the room. Joseph turned to his sons and said, "That's the sound. That's what we need." From that moment, Michael became the centerpiece. He was small, shy, but when he performed, it was like something took over him. Talent shows became battlegrounds. The Jackson 5 weren't just winning, they were dominating. Local crowds couldn't believe their eyes. The youngest kid on stage moved like James Brown and sang like he'd lived 100 lives. But for all their talent, Gary was still Gary. No one from there made it big. They sent demo tapes, knocked on doors, and waited for phone calls that never came. The rejections piled up. Too young, too local, kid groups don't sell. Still, They rehearsed, 5 brothers in matching suits made by their mother, Catherine, who prayed over every needle stitch. They dreamed of Motown, the magical name that had turned regular kids into legends. Stevie Wonder. Marvin Gaye, the Supremes. Joseph told them, "If we can just get in front of Berry Gordy, he'll see it. He'll see what I see." But Gordy never called. The doors stayed closed, until one night in Chicago, the Jackson 5 opened for another Motown act, Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers. Bobby watched their set, eyes wide. He'd seen performers before, but never a kid like Michael. He told his bandmates, "That boy's not normal. He's born for this." After the show, Bobby promised to tell someone who could change everything. The next week, a call came. From Motown, from Diana Ross. The Jacksons couldn't believe it. Diana Ross, the voice of the Supremes, wanted to see them, and she wasn't coming alone because she had a promise to make. A promise that would take them straight into the heart of Motown. But the higher you climb, the sharper the eyes watching you. It began quietly, a phone call, a name, and then a visit. Diana Ross, the shining star of Motown, wanted to meet the little group from Gary. The Jackson family waited anxiously in a Detroit rehearsal room, dressed in their best. Their clothes were pressed, shoes polished, hearts racing, and then she walked in. Graceful, confident, radiant. Diana Ross was everything they'd imagined a star to be. She smiled warmly at the boys, but her gaze stopped at Michael. He was shy, eyes down, fidgeting with his jacket. "Is this the one?" she asked softly. Joseph nodded. She knelt down and said, "Hi, Michael. I heard you've got something special." Michael whispered, "I hope so." They sang for her, a few songs, polished but raw. The room filled with harmonies that didn't sound like children. When Michael's solo came, Diana's smile faded, replaced by quiet disbelief. She wasn't just hearing talent. She was hearing truth. After the last note, she sat in silence. Then she turned to her assistant and said, "Berry has to hear this, immediately. Berry Gordy was a man who built an empire on instinct. He discovered voices that reshaped culture. But when Diana called him that night, he wasn't impressed. "Another kid group?" he said flatly. "We've seen hundreds." Diana didn't back down. "This one's different," she insisted. "You have to see them yourself." "You have to see him?" Berry hesitated. He trusted Diana, but the market was ruthless. Child groups rarely lasted. He sighed. "All right. One audition." Just one. When she told the Jackson family, Joseph nearly dropped the phone. Motown. Berry Gordy, the man who turned dreamers into stars. The family packed their instruments, their matching suits, their hopes, and drove from Gary to Detroit. All those years of singing in tiny rooms and talent shows had led to this moment. But inside the car, Michael sat quietly. He looked out the window, watching the world blur past, his mind filled with fear. What if Berry Gordy didn't like them? What if he laughed? What if everything his father promised, everything they'd worked for, vanished in 3 minutes? As they pulled into Motown's headquarters, his brothers tried to joke to stay loose. But Michael couldn't smile. He could feel something heavy pressing down on his chest, like destiny itself had walked into the room before him. Inside, the stage was set. Executives filled the room. Berry Gordy sat in the middle, arms folded, eyes calm but sharp. Diana Ross gave Michael a reassuring look. "You've got this, baby," she whispered. Michael nodded, but his hands trembled. He looked at his brothers, at Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, Jackie, each one silently praying he wouldn't crack under pressure. Berry leaned back, unimpressed. "All right," he said. "Let's see what you've got." For a heartbeat, no one moved. And then the music began. Michael stepped forward, swallowed his fear, and gripped the microphone. It was too tall. He had to rise on his toes to reach it. His heart was racing so fast it hurt. He remembered his father's voice again. "Make them believe." So he did. He closed his eyes, took one long breath, and began to sing. The first line hit the room like thunder. Every note cut deeper than the last. Raw, soulful, impossible for a 10-year-old. People stopped writing, stopped breathing. Berry Gordy's face, blank seconds ago, began to change. Diana Ross smiled. Smokey Robinson leaned forward. They all felt it, the shiver of witnessing something extraordinary. And as Michael sang those final lines, his voice breaking slightly but never faltering, the room was no longer skeptical. It was spellbound. When the music stopped, no one spoke. And in that silence, Berry Gordy's expression told the whole story. A legend had just been born. The air in the Motown audition room felt heavy, almost sacred. What had started as a casual test had turned into something else, something no one expected. Berry Gordy leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes never leaving the boy standing before him. Around him, a few Motown staff whispered to each other, trying not to show their disbelief. They'd seen singers, hundreds of them, but not like this, never like this. The brothers exchanged nervous glances, their instruments clutched like lifelines. Jermaine plucked at the bass strings, trying to stay calm. Tito adjusted his guitar strap, pretending not to notice the way Berry's gaze burned through them. Michael stood still, silent, small. "Go on," Berry finally said. His voice was low, measured. The kind of tone that didn't need to be loud to carry authority. Michael looked at his brothers. They nodded. The music began. It wasn't perfect at first. A shaky tempo, a missed beat, a nervous hand. But the moment Michael opened his mouth, the flaws vanished beneath something larger. He sang, "Who's Lovin' You?" a song written and performed by Smokey Robinson. It was a song about heartbreak, about losing love, regret, and longing. And yet somehow, this 10-year-old sang it like a man who had lived it. The lyrics poured out of him, raw and unfiltered. Each word felt heavier than the one before. His voice rose, broke, healed, and broke again. The adults in the room froze. The engineers who had come to test microphones forgot to breathe. Smokey Robinson himself, standing off to the side, whispered almost involuntarily, "He's singing my song better than me." The words rippled through the room like a quiet explosion. Berry Gordy didn't move. He watched, not just the performance, but the boy himself. How he gripped the microphone with one hand. How he closed his eyes on the long notes, face twisting with emotion. It wasn't mimicry. It wasn't practice. It was truth. For Berry Gordy, this was the real test. He'd seen singers who could hit every note, but none who could make you feel them. And now, in front of him, a 10-year-old was doing exactly that. As Michael reached the climax, his small voice cracked with emotion. But instead of breaking the moment, it deepened it. You could feel every heart in the room drop into the same rhythm as his. For 3 minutes, time didn't move. Then, the song ended. Silence. Not one cough, not one shuffle. Michael opened his eyes slowly, unsure of what he'd see. Berry Gordy's face was unreadable, not angry, not impressed. Just still. The boy's chest heaved as he caught his breath. He wanted to speak, to ask, but his voice was gone, and then Berry stood up. He walked slowly across the room, every step echoing like a countdown. The Jackson brothers didn't dare move. He stopped right in front of Michael. The room held its breath. Berry looked down at the boy who had just defied every expectation he had. "You," he said quietly, "are something else." Then, after a long pause that felt like a lifetime, he smiled. For the first time that day, Berry Gordy, the man who'd built Motown with an iron will, smiled like a man witnessing a miracle. He turned to his team and said, "Sign them. Right now!" The room erupted. Applause, laughter, disbelief, everyone talking at once, but Berry wasn't done. He looked back at Michael, eyes soft now, and said, "Remember this moment, kid. One day you'll understand what just happened here." Michael didn't understand. Not yet, but something inside him had shifted forever, because this wasn't just an audition. It was the moment the world met Michael Jackson, and Berry Gordy, the man who had doubted him, was about to stake his entire reputation on that one voice. What Berry couldn't know was that this one decision would change his life too, because when you discover a legend, you become part of the legend yourself. After the applause faded, after the papers were signed, after the handshakes and hugs, Berry Gordy sat alone in his office, thinking. He had seen brilliance before. He'd discovered stars who filled stadiums and defined eras. But what he had seen today wasn't just brilliance. It was something otherworldly. He leaned back in his chair, replaying the sound of that voice in his mind. That tone. How could a 10-year-old hold that kind of emotion? How could he understand heartbreak, longing, and love? It wasn't imitation. It wasn't training. It was instinct. Pure, unfiltered soul. Berry smiled to himself. That kid, he murmured, is going to change everything. And he was right. Within weeks, Motown was buzzing with talk of the Jackson 5. The studio became their second home. Rehearsals, recordings, endless hours of coaching and polishing. But Berry Gordy knew what he had to protect. He didn't just want to make them stars. He wanted to make them icons. Every move, every sound, every note was crafted with care. Still, there was something he couldn't control. Michael himself. No matter how many times they told him to rest, to slow down, the boy kept asking for another take, another rehearsal. He'd say, "I can do it better, Mr. Gordy. Just one more time." Berry watched him one day through the studio glass, eyes wide with a mix of pride and disbelief. This wasn't just discipline. This was obsession. He turned to an engineer beside him. "He's got it," Berry said quietly. "That fire. You can't teach that." As "I Want You Back" took shape in the studio, Berry could feel history repeating itself. That same chill he felt the first time he heard Stevie Wonder. But Michael was different. There was no ceiling on that voice, no limit to his energy. The Jackson 5's first single dropped, and the explosion was instant. Radio stations couldn't play it enough. Audiences screamed for the little boy with the big voice, and yet, for all the success, Berry noticed something deeper in Michael's eyes, something that never left him, even after all the fame. That same fear he had the day of the audition, the fear of failing, the fear of letting down everyone who believed in him. It haunted him and drove him at the same time. Berry saw it. He recognized it. Because he had lived it himself. He once said, Michael wasn't just performing for applause. He was performing to survive. That's why he never stopped pushing him. He saw the gift, but also the burden. He wanted to protect the boy even as he demanded greatness from him. But the more success came, the less protection Michael had. Motown had created a phenomenon. The Jackson 5 were unstoppable, and Berry Gordy, the man who once doubted them, now found himself watching a child carry the weight of a world's expectations. Late one night, years later, Berry would tell a friend, I thought I was signing a kid group, but what I really did was open the door for a revolution. Because Michael didn't just sing songs, he transformed them. Every lyric became a story. Every note, a heartbeat. Berry remembered the audition again, and that trembling boy, that impossible voice. He realized now what he had witnessed wasn't just talent. It was destiny arriving early, and as he stood in the back of a concert hall years later, the Jackson 5 on stage, the crowd roaring, he smiled quietly to himself. He whispered the same words he had said that first day in the studio. That kid is going to change everything. He already had. But Berry knew something even more profound. That kind of light burns fast. He had seen it before. Geniuses who gave everything to the world and kept nothing for themselves. He worried for Michael, even as he celebrated him. He knew the boy who could sing like an angel might one day pay the price for it, and deep down, Berry carried a truth he rarely spoke aloud. Sometimes when you hear a voice that powerful, it's not just a blessing, it's a prophecy that had already begun to unfold, because that single audition, that one song, had done more than launch a career. It had awakened something unstoppable. Michael Jackson was no longer the shy boy from Gary, Indiana. He was becoming something larger, something untouchable, and Berry Gordy, sitting in the crowd, could feel it. He wasn't watching his discovery anymore. He was watching history being written in real time. The same voice that stunned him years earlier was now shaking the world, but Berry couldn't shake one memory, the look in that 10-year-old's eyes right before he sang, the quiet fear, the fragile hope, the need to be seen. It was still there, hidden beneath the lights, the fame, the perfection. Because no matter how far he went, no matter how big the stages became, Michael Jackson was still that same boy standing in front of Berry Gordy, praying that his voice would be enough. And it was. More than enough. It was the voice that changed music forever. But every gift has its price, and the price of greatness was only beginning to show. The ink on the Motown contract was barely dry when the transformation began. The Jackson 5 were no longer just 5 brothers from Gary, Indiana. They were now the newest project of the most powerful label in black music history. But Motown was not a playground. It was a machine, elegant, demanding, unforgiving. And at the center of it was Berry Gordy, the perfectionist who had built it from nothing. He looked at his newest signing, the 5 brothers, bright-eyed and nervous, and said one sentence that would define the years to come. Talent will get you noticed. Discipline will make you legends. From that day, the Jackson 5's lives changed forever. Their mornings began before sunrise and ended long after midnight. Voice lessons, dance drills, rehearsals until their feet ached. Every mistake was corrected, every note perfected. Berry Gordy didn't just want good performers. He wanted something never seen before. He wanted flawlessness. He brought in the best choreographers, the best songwriters, the best arrangers. Smokey Robinson, The Corporation, Norman Whitfield, Motown's creative giants, were all called in to craft the perfect sound. And in the middle of all of it stood Michael, barely 10, soaking in every word, every sound, every movement. He was quiet most of the time, but his eyes missed nothing. He studied everyone. How they sang, how they moved, how they commanded attention. The boy who once sang for survival was now learning to perform for history. But the cost was already showing. His brothers could rest between takes. Michael couldn't. Berry and Joseph both demanded more from him. Joseph, ever the stern father, reminded him that this was the family's future. Berry, the visionary, pushed him to be extraordinary. The two men had different motives, but their pressure landed on the same small shoulders. When Michael sang "I Want You Back" in the studio for the first time, even Berry was stunned. The boy delivered every lyric like it was life or death. "Again," Berry would say, and Michael would nod, sweating, exhausted, but still go again. No matter how late it got, there was something in him that refused to settle for good enough. Even as a child, he seemed haunted by the idea that perfection was the only way to survive. And soon, it began to pay off. When "I Want You Back" hit the airwaves, it exploded. The energy was infectious, the voice unforgettable. Radio stations played it non-stop. Crowds screamed the moment the Jackson 5 appeared anywhere. They were an overnight phenomenon, but Berry Gordy knew better. Nothing overnight ever really was. This success was built on sweat, on sleepless nights, on the fire inside that small boy's chest. The Jackson 5's next singles, ABC and The Love You Save, went straight to #1. Motown had struck gold again, but this time it felt different. This wasn't just another act. This was a movement. Everywhere they went, fans lost control. Little girls cried. Grown men shouted. People called Michael the Little Prince of Pop. He was magnetic. Not because he tried to be, but because he couldn't help it. Even Berry found himself smiling during their live shows. "That's not performance," he told a colleague. "That's possession." Yet behind every perfect smile and polished move, there was exhaustion. Michael's childhood was disappearing under studio lights. He missed school plays, birthdays, ordinary moments that other kids took for granted. Once, during a break in recording, he asked Berry softly, "Do you ever get tired of music?" Berry looked at him for a long moment. "Only when it stops being honest," he said. Michael nodded slowly. "Then I don't think I'll ever get..." tired. It was the answer of a boy who already belonged to his craft, completely. But that devotion, that obsession, would become a double-edged sword, because, while the world saw perfection, inside Michael, a new kind of storm was forming, the kind that no one, not even Berry Gordy, could control. The world had found its next superstar. But the boy behind the star was starting to disappear, and as Motown pushed for bigger tours, faster records, and higher expectations, Michael's dream was becoming something else, something that demanded more than any child could give. The same voice that made him a legend was beginning to trap him. Fame arrived fast, and it didn't knock before entering. By the time Michael turned 11, he wasn't just famous. He was idolized. Crowds screamed his name. Reporters followed the Jacksons everywhere. Motown executives spoke of him not as a child, but as a brand. And Michael? He smiled for the cameras. He danced harder than ever. He gave everything the world asked for. But behind those bright lights and applause, something darker was growing. Because when you're that young, and everyone calls you perfect, you start to believe you have to be. Every show had to be flawless. Every note exact. Every movement synchronized. Anything less felt like failure. Berry Gordy noticed it, that unrelenting drive, and it both amazed and worried him. He once told an associate, "That boy rehearses like he's fighting for his life." And in a way, he was. Music had become Michael's identity. Without it, who was he? As the Jackson 5 continued to rise, Motown's pressure tightened. The schedules became brutal. Tours, interviews, recordings, rehearsals. The group barely had time to sleep, let alone breathe. But the one who felt it most was the youngest. Michael's voice, once full of innocence, began to mature. Motown noticed, and they feared it. That boy sound was part of the brand. So they tried to preserve it as long as possible. Producers adjusted keys, engineers softened edges. Everyone tried to freeze time. But time doesn't listen. At night, when everyone else slept, Michael would stay awake, replaying his own recordings. He'd whisper to himself, "I can do better. I can always do better." It wasn't competition anymore. It was compulsion. He was chasing something invisible, a sound that lived in his mind but never seemed to exist in reality. And Berry Gordy, for all his genius, didn't know how to stop it. He'd seen ambition before, but this was different. This was obsession mixed with innocence. During one recording, Berry walked into the booth after a particularly difficult take. Michael looked frustrated, tears in his eyes. "I can't get it right," he said softly. Berry crouched beside him. "You already did," he replied. Michael shook his head. "No, not like I hear it." That moment haunted Berry for years. Because he realized Michael wasn't competing with anyone else. He was competing with perfection itself. The Jackson 5 became unstoppable. 4 consecutive #1 hits, sold-out tours, magazine covers. But with every triumph, Michael's burden grew heavier. On stage, he looked like pure joy, smiling, spinning, glowing. But off stage, his laughter faded quickly. The boy who once sang in his living room now rehearsed in hotel corridors, airplanes, and dressing rooms. The world was his stage, but there was no curtain call, no rest. And then came the whispers, from reporters, from rival artists, asking, "Can he keep this up? He's just a child." Berry ignored them publicly, but privately he wondered the same thing. He had created stars before, but this was something else. Michael wasn't just an artist. He was a phenomenon wrapped in fragility. During one Motown party, an executive raised a glass and said, "To Michael Jackson, the youngest legend alive." Everyone cheered. Michael smiled politely, but inside, he felt the weight of those words sink in. Legend. It sounded beautiful. But legends don't get to rest. Legends don't get to be children. That night, he sat alone in his hotel room, staring out the window at the flashing lights of Detroit. He whispered, "They love me, but they don't see me." He didn't know it yet, but that sentence, quiet, painful, honest, would follow him all his life. Berry Gordy saw the exhaustion in his eyes, but the machine couldn't stop now. Motown was thriving. The Jackson 5 were global, and the world demanded more. The boy who once had one song to prove himself was now trapped in proving himself every single day. And yet, despite it all, when Michael walked on stage, everything vanished. The pressure, the fear, the exhaustion. For a few minutes, under the sound of music, he was free again. The same boy who had stood trembling before Berry Gordy years earlier. But Berry noticed something else during those performances. A flicker in Michael's eyes. Something both powerful and fragile. It was brilliance. And it was breaking him. He realized what he had feared from the beginning. The very gift that made Michael Jackson extraordinary was also the thing that would never let him rest. The perfection, the emotion, the obsession. It was too big for any one person to carry, especially a child. Berry once said quietly to a friend, "Michael doesn't sing songs. He becomes them. And that's what scares me." He was right. Because soon, the little boy who sang his way into history would start to lose the one thing that made him happiest, the innocence behind the music. Fame had given him everything he dreamed of. But it was also beginning to take everything else away, and deep down, even at 11 years old, Michael could feel it. He couldn't explain it, but he knew something was changing. The applause was louder. The lights were brighter. But the silence after the shows was getting colder. Every time he sang, he won the world. But lost a piece of himself, and Berry Gordy, the man who saw his spark first, could only watch as that spark grew into a fire too powerful to contain. The question no one dared ask yet was the one that would define his future. How long can a genius carry the weight of perfection before it crushes him? The year was 1971. The Jackson 5 were unstoppable, the biggest act Motown had ever produced. Their faces filled magazine covers, their records flew off store shelves, and their concerts caused riots. But in the midst of the noise, something subtle began to shift. Michael, now nearing 12, wasn't just singing songs anymore. He was feeling them, shaping them, wanting more control. He wasn't content being told what to sing, how to move, what to say. Inside that small frame, an artist was awakening. Berry Gordy noticed it. The growing confidence, the curiosity in Michael's questions. Why does that chord make people cry? What if we start with the chorus instead? Can I try the harmony this way? These weren't questions from a child. They were the instincts of a creator. But Motown had rules. It was a hit factory, not a playground. Songs were written by teams, produced by veterans, approved by Berry himself. Artists performed, they didn't question, and that's where the friction began. Michael started pushing boundaries in the studio. He'd suggest changes to lyrics, add impromptu runs, alter phrasing, small rebellions that often made the songs better. Berry admired it, but he also feared it. Because he knew once artists start asking why, they stop being owned. There was one moment that changed everything. During a recording session for a new track, Berry asked Michael to try a more upbeat take. Michael hesitated. "But the song feels sad," he said. Berry smiled patiently. "We sell happiness, Mike." Michael looked down. "Even when it's not honest?" That sentence hung in the air. Even Berry didn't have an answer. From that day, Berry began seeing Michael differently. Not as a product, but as a prophet of feeling. This was no longer a child mimicking soul. This was soul itself. Pure, unfiltered, dangerous. And then came the day Berry would never forget. The Motown Showcase of 1971. Executives, investors, and artists gathered to witness Motown's future. The Jackson 5 were scheduled to close the show. Berry had seen them hundreds of times before, but that night felt different. When Michael stepped on stage, the air shifted. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't even performing. He was living the music. He sang like he was speaking to every soul in the room, like he'd been waiting his whole life for this single performance. The band followed his lead instinctively. His brothers locked in behind him, and for 5 minutes, time itself seemed to stop. When the song ended, the crowd exploded. Even the hardest Motown executives stood clapping, some with tears in their eyes. Berry Gordy didn't clap. He couldn't. He was frozen, staring at the stage, because in that moment he realized the truth he had always known but never said out loud. He wasn't looking at an artist. He was looking at destiny. Later that night, as the crowd dispersed, Berry found himself alone backstage. Michael was sitting on a crate, sipping soda, his feet swinging like any normal kid. Berry walked up and asked, "Do you know what you just did out there?" Michael smiled shyly. "I just sang." Berry shook his head. "No, you changed the room. You made everyone feel something they didn't expect." Michael looked thoughtful. "Then that means I did it right." Berry never forgot that conversation. It was the moment he understood this boy wasn't made for Motown. He was made for the world. But with that realization came a quiet fear, because Berry also knew if Michael kept growing like this, Motown wouldn't be able to hold him. And somewhere deep inside, Berry began preparing for the inevitable, the day the boy he'd discovered would walk away from the empire he'd built. But that day wasn't here yet. For now, Berry could still call him Kid. For now, Michael still called him Mr. Gordy, but both of them could feel the clock ticking. And fate, as always, was waiting for its cue. It happened one night, almost by accident. Motown had arranged for the Jackson 5 to attend a show, a tribute concert honoring the pioneers of soul music. Michael didn't know the full lineup, but when he found out James Brown was performing, his heart almost stopped. This was the man he'd watched on television as a child, the man whose energy had set his dream on fire, and now he was about to see him in person. When James Brown walked onto the stage, something electric filled the room. His presence was commanding, his movement explosive. He didn't perform songs, he performed himself. Michael watched, unblinking, memorizing every twitch, every spin, every shout. He could feel his heartbeat sync with the rhythm. This wasn't just music. This was truth-made sound, and for the first time in years, Michael wasn't the performer. He was the child again. After the show, Berry Gordy arranged a brief meeting backstage. Michael could barely breathe as they walked toward the room. And then, the door opened. There he was. James Brown, sweat still glistening on his face, eyes sharp, smile wide. Berry introduced them. "James, this is the young man I've been telling you about. Michael Jackson." Brown turned, looked him up and down, and said in that gravelly voice, "So you're the kid taking over the world," Michael stammered. I learned from watching you," James laughed. "Then I better keep moving, huh?" They both laughed, a pure, unguarded moment between legend and legacy. Then Brown leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You got something special, son. But remember, the world'll love you until it doesn't. So make sure you love the music more than their applause." Michael nodded slowly. The words landed like prophecy. Berry watched silently. He knew this meeting wasn't just symbolic. It was spiritual. The torch passing from one generation to the next. That night, back in his hotel room, Michael sat by the window again, the city lights flickering below. He could still hear James Brown's words echoing, "Love the music more than their applause." And something clicked inside him. He realized that all the fame, all the perfection, all the expectations, they were nothing compared to the feeling of pure music. The same feeling he had when he first sang as a child. The same feeling that made Berry Gordy believe. In that moment, Michael made a silent promise to himself. He would never lose that feeling again. No matter how big he became, no matter how many people tried to control him, he would always serve the music first. It was the vow that would guide his entire life, and eventually destroy parts of it. Because loving music that deeply meant he could never stop. He could never rest. The perfection that once earned him applause would one day cost him peace. Berry Gordy sensed it too. He saw it in Michael's eyes, the same intensity he'd seen at age 10, only now sharper, deeper, unstoppable. He knew this was no longer a child's dream. This was destiny taking shape. Years later, Berry would recall that moment with both pride and melancholy. He'd say, when Michael met James Brown, it was like watching history shake hands with the future. And he was right. That moment wasn't just a meeting. It was a reflection. James Brown had fought to break barriers. Michael Jackson would go on to erase them completely. But that night, in that small backstage room, Berry Gordy understood something else, something few people ever realized. He wasn't just witnessing a meeting. He was witnessing the passing of fire, a fire that would illuminate the world, and one day burn the boy who carried it. As Michael stood outside that night, feeling the cool air against his face, he whispered to himself, "I'll make them remember me." He didn't know then they would. Not just remember, they would never forget. But destiny always demands a price. The boy who had one song to prove himself had proven everything. He had conquered Motown. He had earned Berry Gordy's awe. He had touched James Brown's hand. And now, the world was waiting for what came next. Berry watched him walk away into the night, small and silent, yet carrying the weight of something bigger than any empire, the promise of immortality through music. He turned to his assistant and said quietly, "History just changed again. And this time it has Michael's face." The prophecy was complete. But what no one knew, not even Berry, was that the journey was only beginning. The next chapters would bring triumphs so massive and tragedies so deep that they would redefine what it meant to be human, to be famous, to be Michael Jackson. And somewhere, deep in the echo of Motown's golden halls, the voice of that 10-year-old boy still lingered, soft, pure, eternal, singing the song that proved him once and for all. By the time the 1970s were ending, Michael Jackson was no longer the bright-eyed prodigy Berry Gordy had first met. He had grown, and not just in age but in vision. Motown had made him a star. But stars live in constellations built by others. Michael wanted his own sky. He was restless. The label's strict control, the polished image, the manufactured hits, they no longer satisfied him. He had ideas. He wanted risk, truth, freedom. And so, one of the most difficult decisions of his life took form. He told Berry Gordy, the man who gave him his first chance, that he was leaving Motown. The conversation was tense, heavy with history. Berry leaned back, trying to read the young man before him. "You know what you're walking away from, Michael?" Michael nodded. "Yes, sir. But I also know what I'm walking toward." There was silence. The kind that stretches when two people realize something monumental is ending. Berry finally smiled, though there was pain behind it. "Then go make the music only you can make." And just like that, the boy who had once begged for one song to prove himself walked out to prove himself all over again. It was the end of one story, and the beginning of a legend. What came next defied everything anyone thought possible. When Off the Wall released, critics were stunned. It wasn't just a hit album. It was liberation turned into sound. Michael had fused soul, pop, and disco into something transcendent. For the first time, he wasn't following Motown's blueprint. He was rewriting it. And when Thriller came, the world would never be the same again. Berry Gordy, now an observer rather than a mentor, watched from a distance. He saw the moonwalk, the glove, the music videos that changed television itself. He saw the transformation, not just of Michael, but of culture. The kid he'd once told, "You have one song to prove yourself," had now proven himself in every language. Every country, every heart. Berry was proud, but also haunted, because he knew he had discovered the boy who would become something the world had never seen before, but also something no one could ever truly understand. The scale of Michael's fame was unnatural. Children screamed his name. Adults fainted at his concerts. He wasn't just famous, he was mythic, and myths, Berry knew, live forever. But they don't live easily. During one quiet evening years later, Berry sat alone and watched footage of Michael performing Billie Jean. Every move was perfect, every beat divine, and yet Berry couldn't shake the memory of that 10-year-old boy standing nervously in the Motown studio, waiting for a chance to sing. He whispered to himself, "You did it, Mike. You really did it." But even he couldn't ignore what the world was doing to him. The scrutiny, the pressure, the loneliness that came with being everywhere and nowhere all at once. Because Michael had become what Berry once dreamed of creating. An artist so big, so magnetic, that he transcended music itself. But what no one saw was the cost. The child who once wanted to make people happy now found it almost impossible to find happiness himself. Every performance was flawless, but every night ended in silence. Berry knew that silence well. It was the sound of genius left alone with itself. He had built stars before, but never one that burned this bright, or this fast. And yet every time Michael appeared, every time that spark ignited, the world forgot everything else. He was no longer just the boy from Gary, or the student of Motown, or even Berry Gordy's prodigy. He was music personified, and Berry, watching from the shadows, realized something deeper, something only he could fully understand. That moment when a 10-year-old boy stood before him, trembling, ready to sing, wasn't just the start of a career. It was the start of a revolution that would outlive them both. But as the applause grew louder, Berry began to wonder, would the world ever truly see Michael, the boy behind the brilliance? Or would they only love the illusion they'd created? The question lingered in his mind like a melody with no end, and it would return one final time, years later, in a moment Berry never forgot. The day he said goodbye. The news spread across the world in seconds. Michael Jackson is gone. Berry Gordy sat in stunned silence, the television flashing with images of the boy he once met, now immortalized in memory. Crowds wept. Cities fell quiet. The world, for the first time, felt smaller, emptier. It didn't seem real. How could the voice that had once filled every room simply vanish? Berry remembered the first time he heard that voice, high, trembling, but powerful enough to move grown men to tears. Now that same voice belonged to history. At Michael's memorial, Berry took the stage, his hands shaking slightly as he looked out at thousands of faces, fans, family, friends, all united by the same loss. He began to speak softly, his voice filled with both pride and grief. When Michael first walked into my office, he was just a little boy with big eyes and a bigger dream. He sang one song, and I knew this was something heaven had sent us. He paused, collecting himself. I've seen many artists in my life, but there was only one Michael Jackson. He wasn't just talented, he was magic. The crowd fell silent. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Berry continued. He taught us that music has no color, no boundaries, no limits. He changed how the world dances, how it dreams, how it feels. Then he said something that no one forgot. When I met Michael, I told him he had one song to prove himself. He didn't just prove himself that day. He spent his life proving that greatness has no age, no end, and no equal. His voice broke slightly as he added, Michael was like a son to me. And I believe, wherever he is now, he's still singing. The crowd erupted into applause. Not the wild kind, but the slow, reverent kind that comes from hearts breaking together. Berry stepped back, tears in his eyes, and whispered something almost no one heard. He never stopped proving it. That night, as the lights dimmed and the world mourned, Berry sat alone once again, older now, quieter, surrounded by memories. He thought of the first day in that Detroit studio, the nervous boy, the hopeful father, the one song that changed everything, and he realized something profound. Michael's life had been both a miracle and a warning. A miracle of what art can achieve, and a warning of what fame can destroy. Berry smiled sadly. He gave everything to the music, even himself. Outside, the night was silent. But in that silence, Berry could almost hear him. That unmistakable voice, that eternal rhythm. It was as if the music hadn't died. It had just gone home. In the years that followed, Berry often spoke about Michael. But his tone was always the same. Gentle, reverent, haunted. He would say, Michael was born to remind us what human potential looks like when it refuses to be ordinary. And whenever someone asked him what he remembered most, Berry would always pause before answering, "The moment he sang for the first time. Because I didn't just hear a boy. I heard the future." Even decades later, that moment still echoed through him, the sound of destiny unfolding in real time. Because when Michael Jackson sang that first song, he didn't just change Berry Gordy's life. He changed music itself. Every beat that came after, every artist, every stage, every dream, carried a piece of that sound. The sound of courage, of innocence, of something too beautiful, too rare, too powerful to ever truly fade. And maybe that's what Berry understood in the end. That some voices aren't meant to last forever, because forever isn't long enough. As he once said quietly in an interview years later, Michael's story began with one song. But that song, it's still playing. It always will. And somewhere, in the quiet beyond the noise, you can almost hear it, the voice of a 10-year-old boy, trembling but fearless, singing the words that would one day make the whole world stop and listen. The boy who had one song to prove himself, and proved everything.